The storm hit the Harrow Creek Valley in 2 waves, and by the time Evan Driscoll's truck reached the switchback on Copperhead Ridge Road, the second wave had buried the highway under 6 inches of fresh snow and was working on a 7th. He wasn't driving toward anything. That was the truth of it, though he wouldn't have said so out loud. He drove on winter nights the way some men drink. Not to arrive anywhere, just to fill the hours that refused to fill themselves. His truck, a 12-year-old Silverado, with a cracked defroster and 60,000 kilometers more than it should have, groaned through the storm like something that understood the feeling. On the passenger seat, folded over the headrest, sat a pair of canvas gardening gloves. Dark green, stained at the fingertips with clay and dried soil, still holding the shape of the hands that had worn them. Carol Driscoll had been particular about her gloves. She'd owned 3 pairs and called each of them by name. These were the good ones, the ones she used for the rose beds along the south fence. Evan had found them in the glove box after the funeral and left them there. 26 months later, they were still the first thing he saw when he started the truck. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with the deliberate stillness of a man trained to move only when it meant something. His dark hair had gone mostly gray at the temples. A vertical scar crossed his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a fast rope extraction in a country he was no longer permitted to name. His hands on the steering wheel were large and scarred and steady, in the way that only very tired hands become. He had spent 16 years as a Navy SEAL and had never once doubted his ability to do what needed doing. He had also missed the signs that his wife was sick until the doctors were already measuring time in months. That was the thing that lived in him now, crouched somewhere below the ribs. Not the grief of losing her, but the particular guilt of having been trained to see danger in the dark and failed to see it in his own kitchen. The headlights caught something in the ditch. Evan's foot found the brake before his mind finished the question. The truck slid sideways on the packed snow, corrected and stopped. He sat for a moment, engine idling. Then he grabbed his flashlight from the console and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him like a door slammed open. Snow cut across his face, horizontal and sharp. He walked the shoulder of the road with his flashlight aimed low, and when the beam found what was in the ditch, he stopped walking. A dog, large, dark-furred, a shepherd of some kind with a broad chest and a silver muzzle that suggested she had seen better years, lay curled in the snow with her body bent around 2 shapes so small they barely registered as alive. One puppy was the color of pale sand, with ears too big for its face. The other was darker, tucked so far into its mother's belly it had nearly disappeared. Both were trembling. The mother was watching Evan with amber eyes that held neither welcome nor accusation. Just the tired, fierce arithmetic of an animal who had run out of options and was waiting to see if this one counted as a threat. He crouched in the snow. "Easy, girl," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since Tuesday. She didn't growl. That was what reached him. Fear would have been understandable. Anger would have been clean. But she only watched him with a question so plain it was almost a sentence. And the question was whether he was worth trusting, or whether trust was just another kind of danger. Evan's throat tightened. For a second he wasn't on a mountain road in British Columbia. He was in a hospital corridor in Vancouver, standing outside a room where a woman with clay-stained hands was telling him it was okay. She wasn't angry. It wasn't his fault. He hadn't believed her then. He didn't believe it now. But he stayed crouched in the snow, and he kept his hand extended, palm up, and he waited. After a long moment, the mother dog lifted her head and pressed her cold nose against his fingers. Something broke open in Evan's chest that he would not have known how to name. He unbuttoned his parka and tucked the sandy puppy against his chest. The tiny animal shivered, then went still. He carried it to the truck, laid it gently on Carol's gloves in the passenger seat, and went back. The darker puppy gave a sound like a creak when he picked it up. Not a cry, just a small announcement of continued existence. He placed it beside its sibling. The mother had not followed. She lay in the ditch watching him with her head raised now, and snow was still falling on her fur. Evan knelt again. "You kept them alive," he said quietly. "Your part's done, let me do mine." She didn't move for 30 seconds. Then, With enormous effort, she stood on legs that were shaking and walked to the open truck door and put her front paws on the running board. He helped her in. She was lighter than she should have been. The drive to the cabin took 11 minutes. He checked the rearview mirror every 90 seconds. The mother, he thought of her as Duchess without meaning to. The name arriving the way certain things do, quietly and without invitation, had her head resting on the edge of the seat, watching her puppies with the focused calm of someone standing a watch. Kit and Rook, he would later name the pups, for reasons he couldn't have explained, except that the names fit the animals they turned out to be. The cabin appeared in the headlights like something half-remembered. It was a timber-frame structure at the edge of Crown Land, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and, inside, a shelf full of seed catalogs that had not been opened since the winter before Carol was diagnosed. Evan had told himself he would deal with them eventually. Eventually had been 26 months ago. He carried the puppies in first, then helped Duchess up the porch steps. Inside he built a fire, clumsily, his hands cold from the wind, and made a nest of old wool blankets near the hearth. He placed Kit and Rook in the warmth and watched their trembling begin slowly to ease. Duchess positioned herself between her pups and Evan, and when he reached past her to adjust the blanket, her lip lifted once. Just once? Fair enough, Evan said. You don't know me yet. He turned his back on her deliberately and busied himself heating water on the wood stove. A moment later he heard her nose the blankets, settling her pups against her belly. A moment after that, he heard her drinking from the bowl he'd placed just within reach. He sat on the floor with his back against the couch and kept the fire going all night. Nell Chadwick arrived at 7 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and the expression of a woman who had decided to come in, regardless of whether she was invited. She was 66, small and weathered, with silver hair tucked under a red toque, and hazel eyes that had the particular steadiness of someone who had met grief head-on and refused to flinch. Her husband Clifford had died of a heart attack 5 years back. Her son Jamie, RCMP, posted to a detachment in the Peace Country, had been shot answering a domestic call 3 winters ago, and buried with full honors in a churchyard she still couldn't visit without stopping at the gate. She had moved through all of it with a practical, undemonstrative courage that Evan had noticed from the moment he'd arrived in Harrow Creek. She had also noticed him. The way he kept his porch light off, the way his truck sat motionless in the driveway for weeks at a stretch. The way he answered fine to every question with the automaticity of a man who had stopped listening to his own answers. Your chimney's been going since before midnight, she said from the doorway. I figured either you were freezing or something was wrong. Evan opened the door wider. Nell stepped inside and stopped. Her eyes went from Duchess to the 2 small shapes asleep against her, and for a moment the practical expression left her face entirely. Oh, Lord, she said softly. She approached at an angle, slowly, not reaching. She crouched a short distance away and looked at Duchess the way a person looks at something that has survived more than it should have. Hello, sweetheart, she murmured. You've had yourself a road, haven't you? Duchess watched her. Then, without the wariness she still showed Evan, she lowered her head. Nell glanced at him over her shoulder. She trusts women faster. Can't say I blame her. You always like this in the morning? Only with people who need it. She stood and unloaded the thermos, then pulled a container of bone broth from her coat pocket. Heat this for her, not too hot. For the next 2 hours they worked in a quiet division of labor that neither of them arranged. Evan kept the fire. Nell warmed the broth, checked Duchess's paws for frostbite, turned the puppies gently to make sure they were breathing evenly. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had cared for things under pressure before and hadn't forgotten how. At one point, she stopped beside the shelf of seed catalogs and looked at them for a long moment without saying anything. Carol's, Evan said, though she hadn't asked. Nell nodded, I know. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She poured him coffee and they drank it while Duchess slept with her pups tucked under her chin, and the fire worked slowly through a cord of birch, and outside the storm began, finally, to slow. On the second night, Duchess burned. The fever came on quickly and without warning, the way bad things tend to in the hours after dark. Evan felt the heat radiating from her fur when he went to check on the puppies, and something in him went very cold and very still, the way it did before a mission when the terrain changed and the plan no longer held. He worked through the night. He cooled her slowly with damp cloths, changed the water, kept the fire at a steady warmth, not too hot, not too cool, and talked to her in the low, continuous voice he'd once used to move frightened men through terrible places. He told her about the road he'd found her on. He told her about the first winter he'd driven Copperhead Ridge after Carol died, when he'd gone out at 2 in the morning just to have somewhere to point the truck. He told her that Kit had been snoring, which was a ridiculous thing for a puppy to do, and that Rook had done something earlier in the day with a pine cone that he didn't entirely understand, but suspected was deeply important to Rook. He called Nell at midnight. She arrived in 12 minutes in a parka over her nightgown, carrying a battery lantern and a small tin of powdered electrolytes she kept in her medicine cabinet for precisely no reason she could have explained in advance. "I have a first-aid brain," she said when she saw him looking at the tin. "Jamie teased me about it." "Good thing," Evan said. They worked together without much talk. Nell was steady in the way of people who have already survived their worst night, and know that most other nights, by comparison, are manageable. She murmured quietly to Duchess while she worked, the way you murmur to something that needs to know it isn't alone. Near 4 in the morning, the trembling in Duchess's body eased. Her breathing deepened. She stopped trying to raise her head every few minutes to check the puppies, and simply let them press against her, and her eyes, when they opened, were clearer than they had been at midnight. Nell sat back on her heels and exhaled very slowly. Evan was watching Duchess. He felt the tension go out of his shoulders in a long, aching wave. After a moment, Duchess lifted her head and placed her muzzle across Evan's knee. Gently, deliberately, the way you place something you've decided to trust. Nell watched this without speaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright. "There," she said quietly. "You brought her through." Evan didn't move. He was afraid that if he moved the moment would vanish. "We did," he said. Nell shook her head. A small, certain motion. "I made tea and held a torch, Evan. You sat on a cold floor and talked a frightened dog back from the edge." She looked toward the window where the first gray light was beginning to gather behind the frost. "That means something. More than one thing, maybe." He didn't answer. He was watching Duchess, and Duchess was watching him, and the fire between them made the whole cabin feel less like a place where a man had been waiting out the winter, and more like a place where something was beginning. By the 4th day, Kit and Rook had discovered that the braided rug in front of the hearth was an excellent surface for extremely serious business. Kit, the sandy one, fearless in the manner of animals, who have not yet learned what fear costs, had developed a preoccupation with one of Evan's wool socks. Rook, darker and more watchful, spent an entire afternoon staring at the wood basket with an expression of profound philosophical concern, then sneezed so hard he fell sideways. Evan laughed. It startled him, the sound of it, hoarse and brief, like something shaking loose from a long winter. Duchess looked at him from the hearth. "Don't," he said. She blinked, unbothered. He was sleeping more. He was opening the curtains in the morning. One afternoon he found Carol's seed catalog open on the table. He didn't remember opening it. To a page on hardy alpine perennials, and he stood there for a long time with his hand on the page and didn't close it. On the 5th morning a knock came at the door. Not Nell's knock, 3 easy taps that meant "It's me, I brought something." This was measured, official. Duchess's head came up from the floor. Kit dropped the sock. Rook backed into his mother's chest. Evan opened the door. The man on the porch was in his mid-40s, lean and weather-worked, with a conservation officer's patch on his olive-green jacket and snow on the brim of his hat. His name tag read Wester. His gray eyes were calm in the way of someone who delivered difficult news often enough to know that delivery didn't make it easier. "Evan Driscoll?" he said. "That's me." Conservation Officer Boyd Wester removed his hat. "I've received a complaint. Someone along the ridge reported unregistered large canines near this property. possibly wolf hybrid or northern breed females with young. He looked past Evan into the cabin. His gaze found Duchess and held there. Evan kept his voice level. German Shepherd. Found her half frozen in a ditch on Copperhead Road during the storm. I'm not disputing that, Boyd said, but I still need documentation. Evan felt something cold move through him. Beside the hearth, Duchess had risen to standing. Her body was still in wire-taut, ears back, eyes fixed on Boyd with an expression Evan recognized immediately. Not aggression, memory. Somewhere in her history, authority wearing a uniform had not meant safety. Easy, Duchess, Evan said. He moved to her side and placed his hand on her neck. Beneath his palm, she trembled. Boyd didn't reach for her. He stayed where he was and kept his voice quiet. Do you have vaccination records, microchip information? Any documentation establishing ownership? I pulled her out of a snowstorm. She didn't come with paperwork. Boyd sighed. It was not an unkind sound. Mr. Driscoll, this area has had problems. Illegal breeders abandon animals on Crown land, some of them mixed with northern breeds, and they cause real harm. When I get a report about a shepherd-type female with pups, I have to investigate. Who reported it? I can't share that. Evan's jaw tightened. He imagined someone at a window with a phone, turning Duchess into a file number. 72 hours, Boyd said. Get a vet to examine them and put something in writing. Find any record of prior ownership. A tag, a chip, anything domestic. If you can show they're safe, this ends simply. He paused. And if you can't, animal control would need to take them for assessment. Another pause. One beat too long. Possibly separately. Duchess growled. Low and broken, the sound a mother makes when she understands the shape of a threat even without the words. Evan set his hand more firmly against her neck. He looked at Boyd. I carried those pups inside my coat, he said quietly. I sat out on my floor for 3 nights to keep them alive. I watched that dog burn with fever and come back. His voice had gone to the place it went before it became something else entirely. What paperwork covers that? Boyd looked at him for a long moment. His expression wasn't contempt. That almost made it worse. I'm sorry, he said. I can see what this is, but the law doesn't let me walk away from a filed report. He put his hat back on. 72 hours. After the door closed, the cabin felt 2 sizes smaller. Evan called the vet clinic in Harrow Creek. Voicemail. He called Williams Lake. Unanswered. He found the old collar he'd cut from Duchess's frozen neck the first night. Cracked leather, rusted D-ring, the tag worn so smooth whatever had once been stamped into it was gone entirely. He turned it over in his hands twice. A dog with a history. A dog who had belonged to someone, been loved by someone, and then somehow ended up alone on a mountain road in February with 2 puppies and nothing else. He set the collar on the table. We'll sort this out, he told Duchess. I promise you. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that frightened him more than any threat Boyd Wester had delivered. Not distrust, but the ghost of trust, which is what trust becomes after the world has broken it too many times. He turned to the desk for Nell's number. Behind him, from the far end of the cabin, came the soft, deliberate click of the back door latch. He turned around. The door was open 4 inches. Cold air moved through the gap. Beyond it, snowlight poured into the room like cold water. Duchess was gone. Kit and Rook were gone. He found the tracks immediately. Duchess's deep prints moving fast across the yard, the puppy's small, erratic marks veering close to her trail. The forest behind the cabin stood black and dense under a scote the color of iron. The tracks moved toward the tree line with the decisive logic of a mother who had calculated that a forest in February was safer than a human promise she'd been given once before. Duchess. Her name came out thin. He hadn't known how much it had come to mean until he heard it disappear into the trees. He was pulling on his boots before he'd finished the thought. Parka, gloves, the headlamp from the hook by the door, the coil of rope from the storage chest. He called Nell standing on the porch, watching the tracks already beginning to soften at the edges as new snow fell. She answered on the second ring. I need you to call Boyd Wester, Evan said. Conservation officer, tell him she ran. I'll call him, Nell said without hesitation, and then I'll keep the fire going for when you bring them home. He ran the tree line with his headlamp cutting a tunnel through the dark. Duchess's prints were clear at first, moving north along the ridge. Evan knew this land. In summer he walked it. In winter he'd been warned about a creek bed at the base of the north slope. Unstable ground, undercut banks, places where snow bridged nothing but air. He pushed harder. A branch snapped somewhere to his left. A second light cut through the trees. Boyd Wester appeared between two pines, hat crusted with snow, field coat replacing the uniform jacket, a coil of department rope over one shoulder. The official mask was completely gone. What was underneath looked like a man who had decided that regulations were a poor lantern in weather like this. "Nell called the station," Boyd said. He held up the rope. "I know this ridge. Which way?" Evan pointed north. Boyd fell in beside him. They tracked in silence. The prints grew erratic. Duchess slipping, correcting, her gait changing where the ground began to drop. The puppy's marks became scattered and small, nearly lost under fresh powder. Then the prints stopped at a ragged lip of snow. And from below, from the creek bed, from the undercut bank, came a sound so faint Evan would have taken it for wind if his body hadn't already been moving toward the edge. A whimper, thin and broken, unmistakably alive. He dropped to his knees and aimed his headlamp down. 15 feet below, wedged against the frozen creek bank, Duchess lay on her side. One front leg was bent at an angle that meant pain. Dark blood had melted a small halo in the snow beside her paw, and pressed against her chest, tucked under the curve of her neck and ribs, were Kit and Rook, trembling but breathing, held there by a mother who had fallen and still had not stopped protecting what she loved. Evan looked at her for a long moment. He had seen courage in extraordinary places. He had not expected to find it like this. A wounded dog on a frozen creek bed, turning her own broken body into a wall between her children and the cold. "I've got you," he said. His voice was not steady. He didn't make it steady. "I'm coming down." Boyd was already tying the rope to a birch. "You go down, I anchor. You fall, they lose their only way out." That was enough. The descent was not graceful. The snow wall collapsed under Evan's boots, and he slid 8 feet before the rope snapped taut against his waist, and the impact woke an old injury in his left shoulder. A fast rope extraction. Years ago, a country he wasn't permitted to name, and the pain was bright and immediate, and he bit down on it and kept moving. He worked his boots into the frozen bank, hand over hand, until he was crouching beside Duchess on the narrow shelf of ice beside the creek. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright with pain and something else, the expression of an animal that had exhausted every option and was waiting to see if this counted as rescue or the other thing. "It's rescue," Evan said, as if she'd asked. He tucked Kit inside his parka. The puppy made a sound like a door hinge and then went still with the exhausted relief of something very small that has run out of fight. He tucked Rook beside him. Then he slid his arms beneath Duchess as carefully as he could, and she let him. A flinch when his arm touched the injured leg, but no bite, no pulling away. She rested her head against his shoulder as though she had run out of reasons not to. "Easy," he said. "Nobody gets left behind. That's not how this works." The climb back was the hardest thing Evan had done since the last deployment. His shoulder screamed. His boots broke through the crust twice. Twice the rope went taut, and Boyd's voice came down steady from above. "Push, I have you, push," and he pushed. Near the lip, his strength failed completely. His knees struck the wall. The rope burned through his glove, and then Boyd dropped flat on his stomach at the edge, reached down with both arms, and caught the back of Evan's parka, and pulled until they both rolled onto the snow-covered ridge in a heap, gasping and soaked and alive. Duchess lay across Evan's chest with her nose against his jaw. Kit and Rook squirmed inside his parka, warm and indignant. Boyd knelt in the snow and looked at them. His official face was entirely gone. What he'd come to Harrow Creek to enforce was not what he'd found here, and whatever he was working through, he worked through it in silence. "That leg needs a vet tonight," he said at last. "I know." Boyd took off his jacket and draped it over Duchess without being asked. "Then let's get your family inside." Dawn came pale and slow over Harrow Creek, and Nell was waiting on the porch with the fire already built high, and a look on her face that meant she'd been standing there for a while. Boyd carried Rook inside. Evan carried Duchess. Kit rode in Nell's arms with the peaceful composure of a puppy who has decided everything is basically fine now. The vet, reached finally by Nell at midnight, who drove from Williams Lake through the dark because Nell had asked her personally and Nell did not ask people for things lightly, left before sunrise with Duchess stitched and settled and resting on the braided rug, her injured leg clean and wrapped, her puppies curled against her belly in a way that suggested they had no intention of being anywhere else. Boyd sat at the kitchen table with a coffee going cold in his hands. He hadn't left. Evan hadn't asked him to. "I'll file the report today," Boyd said eventually. He was looking at Duchess. At the puppies breathing in slow, even waves against her. It'll say a former Navy SEAL found an abandoned German Shepherd and her litter during a blizzard on Copperhead Ridge Road. Domestic breed, clearly socialized, no evidence of wild canine lineage. He turned the mug in his hands. It'll also say the matter has been fully investigated and resolved. Evan looked at him. And the 72 hours? Boyd was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes the law needs to watch what it's actually protecting," he said, "before it remembers what it's for." He said it plainly without drama, and the first wall came down not with argument or thunder, but with a tired man in a wet jacket, choosing to see what was in front of him. The weeks that followed were not quiet. They were a different kind of noise. Duchess healed the way Evan had come to recognize as her particular approach to everything, with patience, without complaint, and with one eye always moving between her pups. Her injured leg grew stronger in small, stubborn increments. Her coat filled in. The hollows above her hip bones gradually softened as weight returned. She still watched doorways when strangers entered. She still counted Kit and Rook with her nose before she slept, touching each one as though taking a census she couldn't afford to lose. Kit grew into exactly the dog his name suggested, quick, bold, perpetually half-committed to whatever he was doing. He discovered the shelf of seed catalogs, and on a Thursday afternoon, while Evan was on the phone with Boyd about permit applications, pulled 3 of them onto the floor and sat on them with tremendous satisfaction. Evan stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scattered catalogs and the sandy puppy sitting triumphant in the middle of them. Something shifted in his chest. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, more like grief quietly making room. He picked up the one on top, hardy alpine perennials. Carol had circled things in pencil throughout, little spiraling check marks beside plants she intended to try. He carried the catalog to the table and sat down and read through the circled pages, and he didn't put it back on the shelf when he was done. Boyd returned twice that first month with paperwork and practical help. Permit contacts, a regional rescue network, a quiet word with the vet about documentation. Nell arrived with soup and a blue notebook in which she began keeping records with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who had decided, without being asked, that if they were going to do this, they were going to do it properly. "If you're going to accidentally become a dog man," she told Evan one afternoon, "you might as well be an organized one." "I did 16 years in the Navy," Evan said. "I think I can handle a notebook." Nell handed him the notebook and a pen. "Then you won't mind doing the supply inventory." He minded. He did it anyway. The first dog to arrive was Cole, a retired military working dog, a Belgian Malinois, with a graying face and a way of standing at the window that looked very much like keeping watch. His handler, a veteran named Sherman Doig, 57, built like a man who had carried heavy things for a long time and forgotten there was another way to stand, brought him in on a Wednesday in early March. "He doesn't sleep in the kennel," Sherman said. "He just stands there." "I know that kind of not sleeping," Evan said. That night, Duchess walked to Cole's kennel and lay down outside the door. She didn't bark. She didn't nudge him. She simply stayed, in the way that certain kinds of presence say more than intervention could. Sherman, watching from the hallway, turned away. His shoulders moved. By morning, Cole had eaten half a bowl and was lying down. Word moves through small places the way water moves through cracks. Not quickly, but everywhere eventually. By April, Nell's blue notebook had 3 more pages of names, and the old woodshop behind the cabin had been converted into a proper kennel room with insulated walls and a stovepipe and a hand-lettered sign above the door that Evan had painted himself one Saturday afternoon while Duchess sat at his feet and Kit tried to eat the brush. Copperhead Haven. For those who served and those who kept them going. On the afternoon he hung the sign, Nell stood beside him on the step and looked at it for a long time. Carol would have liked this, she said. Evan kept his eyes on the sign. Yeah, he said, she would have liked you too, probably. Nell made a sound that was almost, but not quite a laugh. I'll take that. Spring came to Harrow Creek the way it always does in the interior, apologetically, arriving in pieces, the snow retreating to the ditches, then to the shadows, then finally to the north-facing slopes, where it clung until June. The yard turned soft and then green. One morning, Evan found himself standing at the south fence with Carol's seed catalog and a packet of seeds he'd ordered on an impulse he couldn't remember making. He stood there for a long time with the packet in his hand. Then he dug the first hole. That evening, Duchess lay on the porch with Kit, and Rook sprawled across her like two boneless scarves. And the late light came through the pines at an angle that made everything look as though it had been waiting for exactly this arrangement. Evan sat on the porch steps with a coffee going cold, thinking about Carol. Not the hospital room, not the last morning, but Carol in the garden, talking to the rose canes the way she always had, insisting they could hear her. He thought about how she used to say the best thing about a garden was that it asked nothing of you except to show up. He thought maybe the same was true of dogs. He didn't reach for the gardening gloves that evening. He left them on the passenger seat of the truck where they'd been for 26 months, but for the first time he looked at them without the weight behind the looking. They were her gloves. They would stay her gloves, and they could be that without costing him the whole room. Inside, Cole was lying beside Duchess near the hearth. Rook was asleep against Sherman's boot. Kit was engaged in something complicated with a pine cone that probably made sense to Kit. Evan watched the light move through the pines and let himself stay where he was. He had driven Copperhead Ridge Road that February night with nowhere to go and nothing waiting for him at either end. He had opened a truck door in a snowstorm, and what had walked through it had changed the temperature of every room he entered afterward. He had believed he was doing the hard part, the carrying, the fire-keeping, the long nights on the floor. He hadn't understood yet that the hard part, the real work, the kind that requires you to remain, had already begun the moment an exhausted mother dog pressed her cold nose against his open hand in the dark and asked, in the only language available to her, whether he was worth trusting. He had tried to be. Somewhere along the way, without quite knowing when, that had turned out to be enough.